The wine arrives first, then the food. Roasted boar, honeyed dates, platters of oysters still glistening. You're seated, 3 cushions from the Emperor of Rome. Your wife sits beside you. Your daughter, barely 16, adjusts her stola nervously across the table. The room fills with senators, generals, their families. Everyone who matters in the empire is here. And then Caligula stands. He doesn't toast, he doesn't announce anything. He walks slowly around the table, past the consuls, past the prefects, past men who command legions. He stops behind your daughter. His hand rests on her shoulder. He says 5 words to you, not to her. The room doesn't gasp. No one moves because everyone here has already learned what you're learning now. In this palace, objection is permission to die. So you do what every father in this room has done. You smile, you nod. You watch her leave with him. And when she returns an hour later, silent, pale, adjusting her dress, you pour more wine and pretend you saw nothing because Rome just taught you. The empire doesn't care what you saw. It cares what you're willing to forget. If you're here because silence shouldn't erase documented history, then stay. We're going back inside. In 37 AD, when Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus took power, Rome didn't crown a stranger, they crowned a legacy. His father, Germanicus, had been the most beloved general in Roman history. Crowds wept at his funeral. Riots broke out when whispers spread that Tiberius had him poisoned. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, descended directly from Augustus. She'd accompanied Germanicus on campaigns, standing beside soldiers in Germania while pregnant. Their children represented everything Rome told itself it still was: discipline, nobility, military tradition, divine ancestry. When Tiberius finally died, the Senate didn't deliberate. They offered the purple to Gaius, nicknamed Caligula, little boots, from the miniature legionary sandals he wore as a child among the troops. He was 24 years old. Rome erupted in celebration. Political prisoners were released. Gladiatorial games were funded. The granaries were opened. Taxes were reduced. Suetonius records that over 160,000 animals were sacrificed in the first 3 months of celebration alone. For 7 months it felt like the dark years under Tiberius were over. Then Caligula collapsed. October 37 AD. The emperor fell into fever so severe that priests were dispatched to every temple in the city. Senators pledged their lives to the gods if he survived. One, Atanius Secundus, even vowed to fight as a gladiator if the emperor recovered. Philo of Alexandria records that the entire empire held its breath. Grain shipments stalled, markets closed. Messengers rode day and night between Rome and the provinces, carrying updates. For days he lingered between consciousness and death. And when he woke, the records fracture here. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, Philo, Seneca. All of them note the change, but none explain it. Some claim brain fever. Others suggested poisoning. Modern historians have speculated epilepsy, encephalitis, hypothyroidism. But diagnosis doesn't matter. What matters is the man who opened his eyes was not the one who closed them. Within weeks, he declared himself a living god and demanded temples in his image. He forced senators to run alongside his chariot for miles in their togas. He ordered a floating bridge built across the Bay of Baiae over 2 miles long, just so he could ride across it wearing Alexander the Great's breastplate. The construction consumed ships needed for grain transport. He revived the treason courts, the same courts that destroyed his family. And he began altering how the palace held banquets. At first, Rome interpreted these as eccentricities, youthful excess, the arrogance of sudden power. But within months, the pattern clarified. This wasn't instability, this was methodology. Banquets were not optional. Senators received word, the emperor requests your attendance. Bring your wife, bring your daughters if they are of age. Refusal wasn't listed as an option because refusal didn't need to be forbidden. Everyone remembered what happened to families who disrespected Tiberius. So they came. The palace dining hall stretched over 300 feet. Couches lined the walls arranged by rank. Slaves moved between them with wine, fruit, delicacies imported from Egypt and Gaul. Caligula reclined at the head, and he watched. Not the food, not the entertainment. He watched the women. Ancient sources describe what became routine. He would study a senator's wife across the room openly, while her husband sat 3 couches away. Sometimes he commented loudly, comparing her to others, critiquing her appearance, praising features in language meant to humiliate the man, not flatter the woman. Sometimes he gestured. A servant approached. A quiet word. The woman stood because she had no choice and followed. The room continued eating. Conversation resumed. No one acknowledged what just happened because acknowledging it meant choosing. Object and vanish, or stay silent and survive. Rome chose survival every single time. Suetonius writes plainly, he lived in habitual incest with all his sisters, and at large banquets he placed each of them in turn below him, while his wife reclined above. But the sisters weren't the only targets. Seneca, writing decades later, describes how Caligula publicly evaluated the wife of a consul, Lollia Paulina, then removed her from the room. When she returned, the consul did not react. Cassius Dio records, he summoned the wives of men to the palace, as if to honor them. Then, after examining them as though they were slaves for sale, he took whichever one he pleased. Sometimes he sent for husbands as well and forced them to witness. The phrase "as if to honor them" is key, because the summons came with pretense, a gift, a compliment, an imperial favor. Refusal was framed not as self-defense, but as insult to the emperor. And insult to the emperor carried one penalty. Dio continues, afterwards he would return to the banquet and openly discuss what had occurred, offering praise or criticism while the husbands were present. This wasn't secrecy, this was exhibition. The palace kept records. Secretaries documented attendance. Names were logged, who came, who brought whom, who left early and why. Pliny the Elder mentions these records existed for decades, stored in the imperial archives until they were finally destroyed under the Flavian dynasty. Thank you. But while they existed, they served a purpose. They turned every banquet into documentation. Attendance became complicity, and complicity became insurance for the emperor, because men who had participated, who had watched, who had stayed silent, could not later claim ignorance. They were witnesses, and witnesses to imperial crimes became accomplices, which meant they could never testify. Some men were rewarded afterward, given land, titles, positions. Others were mocked, fined, exiled for failing to appreciate the honor. The randomness was structural. If punishment followed resistance, men could unite in refusal. But if punishment was arbitrary, if cooperation might bring reward or might bring nothing, then every man acted alone, isolated, silent. Survival became individual and collective resistance became impossible. Seneca describes the calculation. Men who had once commanded armies now measured their words at dinner, fearing that even agreement might be interpreted as conspiracy. In 39 AD, after uncovering a plot led by Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Gaetulicus, Caligula didn't just execute the conspirators. He went after their families. Their wives were summoned to banquets. Their daughters were evaluated publicly. Then weeks later, after humiliation had settled, the men were formally charged with treason. By then, resistance was already broken. The accusation was just documentation. But Caligula also promoted one of the conspirators' cousins, gave him a command in Germania. The message was clear: loyalty to family could destroy you. Loyalty to the emperor could save you. Choose. Dio records that some senators, anticipating the pattern, sent their wives away to the countryside claiming illness or family obligation. Caligula responded by requiring proof, medical inspections, sworn testimony. If the women did not appear, the husbands were fined or stripped of rank for disrespecting imperial hospitality. One senator, name lost to history, tried a different approach. He brought his wife to the banquet, but seated her between 2 older matrons, hoping visibility would provide protection. Caligula noticed. He commended the senator publicly, praised his devotion, then summoned all three women. When they returned, the senator was assigned to inspect grain stores in Sardinia, a post that meant exile. His wife remained in Rome. The system was explicit. Your family attends or your career ends. And once they attended, they belonged to the palace. But some women didn't wait to be summoned. Lollia Paulina, mentioned earlier, didn't resist when called. Her family had paid fortunes for imperial favor before. She understood the trade. Seneca notes she arrived wearing emeralds worth 40 million sesterces, not as protest, as advertisement. Because in Caligula's palace, being chosen could be framed to the outside world as political success. Families began including these imperial audiences in marriage negotiations. A daughter who had attended the emperor's private chambers could be marketed as having imperial favor. The humiliation was rebranded, and Rome's elite were willing to rebrand it because the alternative was admitting they had no power left at all. But violence alone doesn't explain compliance. Caligula understood that fear exhausts, that people adjust, that even terror becomes routine, so he alternated punishment with reward. After a senator's wife was publicly taken, the senator might be promoted. After a daughter was removed from a banquet, the father might receive a lucrative grain contract. Philo of Alexandria describes watching this in person during his diplomatic visit to Rome. Men of consular rank stood outside the emperor's chambers, waiting, some in dread, some in hope. When their women emerged, they did not weep, they negotiated. The Praetorian guard stood outside every banquet. They escorted the women to the emperor's chambers. They escorted them back. They saw everything, and they said nothing because their role wasn't protection, it was enforcement. The Praetorians weren't loyal to Rome, they were loyal to payment. Caligula doubled their salary immediately after taking power. He gave them bonuses during festivals. He armed them with the best equipment in the empire, and in exchange they upheld one rule: whatever happens inside the palace stays inside the palace. But even financial loyalty has limits. By 40 AD, cracks formed. Cassius Dio, a decorated Praetorian tribune who had served under Germanicus, became a target of the emperor's mockery. Caligula questioned his manhood publicly, gave him degrading passwords to repeat during guard rotations: Priapus, Venus, pleasure. Forced him to kiss his hand in exaggerated submission during ceremonies. Ancient sources described Dio as older, battle-hardened, respected among the ranks, and visibly humiliated. He didn't object, but he stopped smiling. Other Praetorians noticed. Cornelius Sabinus, another tribune, had watched senators humiliated for months. He'd escorted women who left the emperor's chambers weeping. He'd stood guard double her. While their husbands pretended not to notice. And he'd collected his salary. But the passwords were different, because the passwords were directed at them. The Praetorians were being told, "You are no different than the senators. You endure because I allow it." By late 40 AD, multiple plots existed. Senators whispered in private villas. Freedmen passed messages, but nothing moved because Caligula had built a system where individual resistance was suicide and collective action required trust. And trust required knowing who else would act. In a palace where informants were rewarded and silence was survival, no one knew. Dio's conspiracy succeeded not because it was brilliant. It succeeded because it was small, 3 men, maybe 4. No grand speeches, no Senate involvement, just exhaustion. They didn't plan for months. They didn't recruit allies. They waited for an opportunity. January 24th, 41 AD. The Palatine Games. Thousands in attendance. Caligula left the theatre through an underground corridor leading back to the palace. The Germanic bodyguard, his personal unit of towering German soldiers, accompanied him part way, then stopped because Dio told them to. He was their superior officer. They obeyed. Dio and Cornelius Sabinus intercepted Caligula in the narrow passage. The sources describe chaos. The first blow came from behind. Dio's blade struck between the shoulder and neck. Caligula fell, then the others joined. 30 stab wounds, some to the chest, some to the groin, some to the face. They didn't stop until he was unrecognizable. The German bodyguards heard the commotion. They rushed back, but by then Caligula was dead. In the confusion that followed, someone, history doesn't agree who, reached Caligula's chambers. His wife, Suetonius, was killed. His infant daughter, Julia Drusilla, was killed. Her head smashed against a wall, not as justice, as prophylaxis, because as long as Caligula's bloodline survived, someone might seek revenge. And no one wanted revenge. They wanted forgetfulness. When news reached the Senate, they didn't mourn. They debated whether to restore the Republic. For hours, arguments filled the chamber. Some senators called for elections, others proposed a council of consuls rotating power. It felt for a moment like possibility, but the Senate had no army. The Praetorian Guard did. And the Praetorians weren't interested in debate. They found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the palace. The man Rome had dismissed as a fool for years, stammering, limping, ignored at family dinners. The Praetorians declared him emperor, not because they loved him, because he promised to pay them 15,000 sesterces per soldier, the largest donative in Roman history. At that point, the Senate voted to confirm Claudius the same day. The Republic was never mentioned again. Chaerea expected execution. He'd killed an emperor. He'd violated his oath as Praetorian. But Claudius hesitated. Chaerea was popular among the troops. Executing him risked mutiny. For weeks, Chaerea remained in custody, neither charged nor released. Then whispers started. If Chaerea wasn't punished, what message did that send? That killing emperors was acceptable. Claudius finally ordered the execution. Chaerea was beheaded. Cornelius Sabinus followed. The other conspirators, those whose names survived, were exiled or quietly removed from the record. Rome moved on. The records don't say what happened to the women. Lollia Paulina survived. She remarried. Years later, Claudius's wife, Agrippina, accused her of witchcraft. She was exiled, then forced to commit suicide. Other women simply vanished from documentation. Daughters who attended the banquets stopped appearing in family genealogies. Wives mentioned in earlier inscriptions disappear from later ones. Some historians suggest suicide. Others suggest quiet exile. Some propose they were simply written out, removed from memory, the way Rome removed Caligula's statues. Because Rome didn't want a reckoning. It wanted forgetfulness. Caligula's name was erased from monuments. His decrees were annulled. Claudius declared him damnatio memoriae, condemned to oblivion, not to honor the victims, to erase the question of complicity. If Caligula was insane, then Rome didn't fail. It was simply cursed with temporary madness. And madness, unlike cowardice, can't be blamed. The women who survived were given gifts, land, money, compensation for silence, and they took it, because what choice remained? Their testimony would have required Rome to admit what it spent centuries pretending didn't matter. So they accepted the gold, remarried, and disappeared into history. Caligula ruled for 3 years and 10 months. In that time, he didn't invent imperial abuse. Tiberius had committed atrocities on Capri for a decade before him. Suetonius describes how Tiberius forced young boys and girls into sexual acts, sometimes throwing them off cliffs afterward. How he kept nobles imprisoned in his villa, torturing them while pretending they were honored guests. Augustus himself had exiled his own daughter Julia for adultery, though many believed it was political revenge disguised as morality. After Caligula, the pattern continued. Claudius, who Rome thought would restore order, was later accused of murdering his wife Messalina after she humiliated him publicly. Nero kicked his pregnant wife Poppaea to death, then married a boy named Sporus after having him castrated. He forced Sporus to dress as Poppaea and appear in public as his wife. He also hosted banquets where senators' wives were assaulted while their husbands watched, calling it entertainment. Commodus fought as a gladiator and sold positions in the Senate to the highest bidder. Elagabalus forced Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to chastity, into marriages. then divorced them weeks later. He paraded through Rome in women's clothing while assaulting senators' wives at state functions. Caracalla murdered his own brother Geta in their mother's arms, then ordered the deaths of 20,000 of Geta's supporters, including their families. The list continues for centuries. So the question isn't why Caligula did what he did. The question is why Rome acted like it was temporary. After Caligula's death, the Senate debated, restoring the Republic for 6 hours. Then they confirmed Claudius and went home because the Senate had lost its power decades earlier, not suddenly but gradually. Under Augustus, the Senate still appointed governors and controlled finances. Under Tiberius, the Senate still debated laws. Under Caligula, the Senate attended banquets and clapped when told. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Augustus had given the Praetorians permanent status and a salary funded by the imperial treasury, not the Senate. Tiberius had moved treason trials from public courts to private imperial hearings. Caligula simply made explicit what had been implicit. The Senate governed because the emperor allowed it, and that permission could be revoked. When Claudius took power, he didn't restore Senate authority. He thanked them for their confirmation as if their vote had mattered. Then he governed exactly as Caligula had, minus the theatrical cruelty. The structure remained, only the performance changed, and Rome, exhausted, called it reform. Suetonius, writing 70 years after Caligula's death, included the details about the banquets, but he framed them as examples of insanity. Proof that Caligula was uniquely deranged, not that the system allowed it. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, documented the wives who were summoned, but he wrote in Greek for an audience far from Rome. His accounts were histories, not accusations. Seneca, who lived through Caligula's reign, mentioned Lollia Paulina's emeralds, but didn't mention what she wore them for. The sources exist, but they exist as fragments, as anecdotes embedded in larger narratives about imperial excess, never as investigations into why hundreds of men with wealth, power, and military command waited for someone else to act, never as testimony from the women who survived, because asking those questions would have required Rome to confront what it spent centuries denying, that the system had been designed to make resistance impossible. And that silence wasn't cowardice, it was architecture. We know Lollia Paulina's name because she remarried an emperor. We know Suetonia's name because she died with Caligula. We know Julia Livilla, one of Caligula's sisters, because she was later exiled for alleged adultery. But the others, the daughters brought to banquets at 16, the wives summoned while their husbands watched, the women who attended month after month, year after year, knowing what attendance meant, their names exist only as gaps, inscriptions that mention wife of without listing her name, genealogies that skip a generation, marriage contracts that end abruptly. Some historians have tried to reconstruct these lives from financial records. A dowry paid, then returned. A property transfer with no explanation. A will that disinherits a daughter for reasons known to the family. But reconstruction isn't testimony. And without testimony, what remains is structure. The palace, the banquets, the system, and the men who built it. Caligula's assassination didn't save Rome. It taught Rome that spectacle could be tolerated as long as it eventually ended, that humiliation could be endured as long as status remained, that women could be erased as long as lineage continued. The palace didn't close after Caligula, it remained the center of power. The banquets continued under Claudius, Nero, and the emperors who followed. What changed wasn't the system. What changed was that Rome learned to call it statecraft instead of madness. And the women who survived were never asked what they learned, because their testimony would have required Rome to admit what it spent centuries pretending didn't matter, that the empire's power rested not on law or honor or military strength, but on who it taught to stay silent. The records exist. The sources are documented. The names are still there, or they're not. Both absences tell the same story. If history like this matters, if you believe that silence shouldn't erase what was documented, that these gaps in the record are themselves evidence, then subscribe. We keep uncovering these stories, one by one, no sugarcoating, just the raw truth. Because what happened in these rooms didn't make it into most history books, but the records exist, and someone needs to read them.